All right, we're going to go ahead. Um, Thank you for each one that's joined us tonight. Thankful for this. We're continuing our webinar on the history of modern Israel. We got up to the declaration, what their Declaration of Independence on May 14th, 1948, last week, which was immediately followed by the War of Independence, which we're going to get to shortly. I'd like to begin by reading Psalm 83. And this is really an amazing psalm. And those who have studied it believe that this was actually a prophecy of the War of Independence. The different nations that it mentions are very similar to the nations that actually attacked Israel in 1948. Uh, O God, do not remain quiet. Do not be silent. And O God, do not be still. For behold, your enemies make an uproar, and those who hate you have exalted themselves. They make shrewd plans against your people and conspire together against your treasured ones. They have said, come and let us wipe them out as a nation, that the name of Israel be remembered no more. For they have conspired together with one mind. Against you they make a covenant. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagrites, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre. Assyria also has joined with them. They have become a help to the children of Lot. Deal with them as with Midian, as with Sisera and Jabin at the torrent of Kishon, who were destroyed at Endor, who became as dung for the ground. Make their nobles like Oreb and Zeb, and all their princes like Zebah and Zalmunna, who said, let us possess for ourselves the pastures of God. O my God, make them like the whirling dust, like chaff before the wind, like fire that burns the forest, and like a flame that sets the mountains on fire. So pursue them with your tempest, and terrify them with your storm. Fill their faces with dishonor, that they may seek your name, O Lord. Let them be ashamed and dismayed forever, and let them be humiliated and perish, that they may know that you alone, whose name is the Lord, are the most high over all the earth. I'd like to start with a prayer. Lord, we want to thank you for this time together as we look at the history of modern Israel and the amazing ways that you brought together after 1900 years your covenant people. We thank you for the privilege of being able to study this and learn about it tonight. And we ask your blessing upon this as I speak. So we ask your blessing on the speaking and on the hearing. In the name of Jesus, Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen. All right.
Amen.
So, one moment here. I'd like to mention, first of all, just just for the sake, I want you all to know where I've gotten some of this. There's a couple of Israeli history books that I found very helpful. One of them is named is Israel: A History by Martin Gilbert. He's a very distinguished historian. He's written many books on World War II and Churchill and many other things, but he's also this one on Israel. The one that I've used the most is called Israel: A Concise History of a Nation Reborn by Daniel Gordis. I really like it because it's concise and it really, believe it or not, I'm eliminating much, much more than I'm actually sharing. And then there's some CBN documentaries that I've shared, and there'll be a video from a source online called Unpack that we're going to show at the end here that I think is going to be helpful. So let's just jump in here. After the second phase of the war began the day after independence was declared on May 14th, 1948, and it would last until January of 1949. And by the way, this is just an amazing picture to me. This is at the port of Haifa. It was a few months later, but this is when this is up in the north part of Israel, and this is when Israel became the port was turned over to Israel. So you've got Ben Gurion there, and you can see Golda Meir and some others. So anyway, this just lost my foot. It would last until January 1949, consisting of three major phases of fighting, punctuated by two internationally mandated ceasefires. It's interesting to me because right now, as we're doing this, as we're recording this, that we're in the second ceasefire of the war in Gaza right now. But anyway, so the first month of the war would be the deadliest of the entire conflict. Israel would lose 876 soldiers and some 300 civilians. The Haganah, which was the precursor to the IDF, we mentioned that last week, found itself facing armies from five Arab states: Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq, which did not even share a border with Israel, and Syria, augmented by troops from Sudan, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia. So five against one, and really even eight against one, because there were other nations as well. For Ben-Gurion, who consistently saw the new state in light of the Bible's narrative, the fact that Israel was arrayed against Egypt and Syria was enormously important. During the war, in his diary, he said, "We will end the war and settle our ancestors' score with Egypt, Assyria, and Aram." And then you'll see some pictures. This is some of the women of the Haganah. So this was men and women, and it was a necessity that all who are able to fight fought. And that's still true today for Israel. Those lofty aspirations notwithstanding, the first days of the war did not go well. In the north, the Israelis confronted Iraqi and well-armed Syrian armies, nor did matters appear much better in the south. Egyptian troops were quickly advanced in the Negev, that's in the desert, and were soon able to launch air attacks on Tel Aviv, where the Israeli General Staff was headquarters. As Yigal Yadin, the IDF's head of operations during the War of Independence and later its chief of staff, reflected, "I was suddenly shocked when I realized the whole of the north might be lost. In the south, the Egyptian army was advancing on Tel Aviv. Jerusalem was cut off, and the Iraqis were putting pressure on the middle of the country. This was a moment that I suddenly felt that the dream of generations was about to disintegrate." So this is just a few days in, and that's a picture of the Israeli military police in 1948. Ben-Gurion's priority was to push to rescue Jerusalem. Most of his commanders disagreed, feeling that Jerusalem was a lost cause. But Ben-Gurion would say there can be a Jerusalem without an Israel, but there cannot be an Israel without a Jerusalem. The key to supplying Jerusalem was the fortress of Latran, a hilly outpost about 15 miles outside of Jerusalem. And that was the picture of that fortress, which is pretty imposing. Over his general's objections, he ordered an attack on Latran. The first battle of Latran began on May 24th. As Yadin predicted, it was a disaster. Ben-Gurion had ordered that a new unit, the Haganah 7th Brigade, carry out the task. This brigade was made up of new immigrants just arriving from the British camps on Cyprus. The troops had virtually no experience and only the most rudimentary weapons. Many of them didn't even have a canteen. And then this is Yigal Yadin. Was the chief of staff. The continued blocking of the road to Jewish Jerusalem was creating extreme hardship inside the city. The food ration for soldiers and civilians alike was reduced to 2 pieces of bread, thin soup, tinned vegetables, and a gallon of water for drinking, cooking, and washing per person per day. A second attack on Latran seemed imperative. Ben-Gurion was confident that if he unified the military command of the whole area under a first-class commander, all would be well. His choice fell on a graduate of West Point, Colonel David Marcus, who had served on Eisenhower's staff in Europe at the end of the Second World War. In some places, it calls him Mickey Marcus and some David Marcus. So this says David. He had volunteered for service with the Haganah at the start of hostilities. So this was an American who volunteered. On May 28th, Ben-Gurion appointed Marcus to be supreme commander of the Jerusalem front. He was given the rank of colonel and a nom de Mickey Stone, to hide his identity. So that was his fake name. Colonel Stone, quote unquote, led the second attack on Latran, which began on May 30th. Unfortunately, this attack was no more successful than the first one. At least 139 Israelis died in the two attacks on Latrun. Colonel Marcus, or Colonel Stone, would provide much valuable advice to the military of Israel during his time in Israel. Unfortunately, he would not survive the war, as he was killed over the summer in a friendly fire incident. Hollywood would immortalize him in the 1966 movie Cast a Giant Shadow. And I just watched that movie. It's interesting. It has Kirk Douglas in it and John Wayne and a lot of people from that time. It's not a very good movie because they really Hollywood it to be, but it does have some good scenes about that time, especially when it comes to something we're about to talk about. So slightly more than 100,000 Jews enlisted in Israel's army during the War of Independence. And as one historian notes, many of the newcomers who had come from Europe to die in the war for Israel were Holocaust survivors. Many died in battle almost immediately upon arrival and are buried in unidentified graves. They gave their lives defending a state in which no one even knew their names. The failed Latrun operation was followed by another devastating loss days later when the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem's Old City fell to the Arab Legion. Yitzhak Rabin, future prime minister of the state, looked upon the Old City in horror as he saw the Jewish residents surrender to the Arab Legion, white flags waving, the loss etched on their faces. Jews had been exiled from Jerusalem after their defeat at the hands of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, and again under the Romans in 70 AD. Now, once again, long lines of defeated Jews, their meager belongings slung over their shoulders, were exiled from the city and made their tearful way out of Jerusalem. The Jordanians, like the conquerors who had come before them, would show the city no mercy. They would turn synagogues into stables and use gravestones as latrines. 19 years would elapse until Jews would once again be able to touch the Western Wall and to pray at Judaism's most sacred site. And then we have a picture, I think, of the mayor of Jerusalem surrendering to the Arab Legion right there. On June 8th, and think about this, we've gone from May 14th to June 8th, and it has been just an unmitigated, it seems like an unmitigated disaster for Israel. But God was watching over them for sure. On June 8th, knowing that a truce being called by the United Nations was imminent, Ben-Gurion demanded a third attempt to capture Latrun. His order was that the ridge must be taken on the following night, whatever the cost. But he was opposed by one of his commanders, Yigal Allon, and by the brigade commanders. Their reason was not only that a third attack might fail, but that it was no longer needed. In the previous few days, a possible alternative route to Jerusalem, just beyond the range of the Arab Legion artillery at Latrun, had been discovered by chance, and I'll put that in quotes, by two Israeli soldiers making their way down from Jerusalem on leave. Using this route, a formation of 150 soldiers were sent up to Jerusalem and reached the city without incident. Yadin then gave the order for a bulldozer to clear a track that could be used by vehicles. 4 jeeps also managed to negotiate the track to a point where an Arab orchard came to an end at a precipitous hillside 400 feet high. To negotiate this bluff was the main obstacle to opening a passable road. Very reluctantly, Ben-Gurion canceled the third attack on Latrun and approved the road building effort. It would be called the Burma Road, and that was named after a road in World War II in Burma. And that's a picture, I believe, there of the Burma Road. The desperate struggle to build the road on what had been an ancient path reflected the ingenuity that had characterized the underground in the days of the Yishuv, which is the pre-independence time, and now reflected the character of the IDF. Necessity was the mother of invention, and the newly born state, knowing that Jewish blood would flow if it were defeated, was both ingenious and industrious at numerous points during the war. At the Burma Road, for instance, using bulldozers, tractors, and manual labor, the engineers began the nearly impossible task of creating a passable road to the bluff at the head of the orchard and a road to the valley below. At night, against the backdrop of Jordanian shelling, the scene was almost unreal. Hundreds of porters silently carrying food and supplies down the hill to waiting trucks and jeeps and even mules. Even herds of cows were led along this route because we desperately needed to ship beef into the city. Using this alternate route, the Harel Brigade succeeded in resupplying and defending the western parts of the city, but they were still unable to recapture the old city. So if you just to stop here for a moment, if you're just to make sure you're understanding this they found this route that nobody knew about, an ancient path that was very hazardous, and they made a road out of it. And they did it really. I've watched a video of today looking at it, and it was just right on the other side of a ridge. And they did it all at night so that the enemy wouldn't see it. It was really an amazing thing. The first truce went into effect on June 11th after nearly 4 weeks of war. This truce was itself to last for 4 weeks. As the fighting died down, it became clear that Israel was in control of much more territory than she could have hoped for a month earlier. Both eastern and western Galilee were under complete Israeli control, as were the Jezreel Valley from Haifa to the River Jordan, the coastal strip down to a point just north of Asdod, a large pocket in the central Negev, and kept open at such heavy cost, a corridor from the coast to Jerusalem. So even though it seemed like a lot of things were going bad, overall, they claimed more territory during that time. The terms of the truce dictated a blanket embargo on arms and additional military personnel on Israel and the Arab states, but both sides violated these conditions. The Arab states fortified their combat units and intermittently fired across the Israeli lines. The Israelis used the lull in the fighting to import massive amounts of weapons, including some they had purchased from the United States, as well as from other Western powers. They also received a massive shipment of arms from Czechoslovakia, including more than 25,000 rifles, 5,000 machine guns, and more than 50 million bullets. Up until that time, they had been very poorly armed, but now they had more arms. And it was not only weapons that arrived from abroad. At the start of the war, Israel had no military aircraft at all and very few pilots. The American armed forces, on the other hand, had surplus planes by the hundreds after World War II, and Jewish veterans who had flown for the United States. Israel began a clandestine project of seeking out these pilots, many of whom were highly assimilated. And here's some of the pilots. Something about the Holocaust, however, awakened a sense of Jewish commitment in some of these men, and a few, in violation of American law, helped purchase American surplus planes and fly them to Europe and then to Israel. They were outfitted with used uniforms, which, like some of the guns of those fighting on the ground, had Nazi insignias, in this case, Luftwaffe patches on them. A stream of volunteers had begun to arrive in Israel from abroad, men and women who left their work and families in order to be of service on the battlefield. Many of them had experience of Second World War activities as engineers, signalmen, artillerymen, armored corps experts, doctors and nurses, infantry, seamen, and pilots. There were a number of Christians among them who did not want to see the Jewish state destroyed. These volunteers went by the name of Mahal, which was the Hebrew acronym for volunteers from abroad. And I think we have a picture of some French Mahal volunteers there. An estimated 5,000 volunteers came to serve with the Israeli Defense Forces, the largest national groups being 1,500 from the United States and Canada, 1,000 from Britain, 500 from South Africa. Even Finland made its contribution of 30 volunteers. More than 150 Mahal volunteers were killed in action. About 300 of those who came stayed on in Israel after the war or returned to settle there soon afterwards. But most returned home, their service done, their contributions made to the survival of the Jewish state. Historian Betty Morris notes that in addition to its military significance, this wave of volunteers helped Israelis understand that though they were outnumbered, they were not alone. And I can imagine how much of a help that was to them. Yitzhak Rabin was among those Israeli soldiers who had never forgot the contribution of the volunteers. On his visits to Britain in later years, especially as Prime Minister, he always set time aside to meet and talk with those who had once served under him in the Mahal. 44 years after the War of Independence, in dedicating the Mahal Memorial in Israel, and here's a picture of that memorial, Rabin told the former soldiers and the families of those who had died fighting, "You came over here not knowing the conditions. Many of you didn't even know the language, the Hebrew language. My generation will never forget what you have done, how much you made it possible for us to achieve what has been achieved." Mahal volunteers with experience of aerial warfare were often assigned to take part in air attacks on the day they arrived in the country. Pilots were in such short supply that there was no time for formalities or practice. On one occasion, a Mahal crew that was arriving across the Mediterranean in a flying fortress was directed by the Israeli Air Force radio controller to bomb Cairo while still on its way to Israel. The crew thus carried out their first bombing mission without having seen the country for which they were fighting. I found that pretty fascinating. The work of the Mahal volunteers was continuous. Within 36 hours on July 18th and 19th, a South African surgeon, Dr. Stanley Levin, one of 500 South Africans who had volunteered to help out for the duration of the war, performed 28 successive operations on severely wounded soldiers without leaving the operating theater. So he was certainly a hero as well. The next phase of the war began on July 8, 1948. It lasted only 10 days before another truce went into effect. With the ending of the first truce, fighting was resumed on all the fronts. The principal Israeli effort was in the center of the country, where Arab control of the two Arab cities of Lydda and Rami provided a permanent threat both to all north-south and to east-west communications. The Israeli High Command also hoped to seize the Arab town of Ramallah, north of Jerusalem, to widen the corridor to the city and make it less vulnerable to attack through its northern suburbs. Both of these cities were captured during this time. During the fighting in Lydda, thousands of Arab civilians panicked, left their houses, and were caught in the crossfire. Approximately 250 of them were killed. The Israelis lost no more than 4 soldiers. Now, there was a little conflict in some of my sources. One of my sources stated that the IDF and local Arab leadership reached an agreement that the population would leave Lydda and move east. But another one said that Ben Gurion made the difficult decision to expel the Arab inhabitants of those two cities. But in any event, within 24 hours, 50,000 Arabs were moving from these towns. In the intense July heat, an estimated 335 refugees died, including many children. And so this kind of brings us to talk about the refugee issue. And this is really what I'm going to be talking about here in a little bit is the source of the Palestinian conflict that we see today was in this very time. The War of Independence was a brutal war. It was a war of honor for the Arabs and a war of survival for the Jews. There were brutal acts on both sides. Historian Betty Morris does note that on the Israeli side, they were exception. On the Arab side, brutality was the rule. Everywhere where one turned in the area, there were lines of devastated refugees. Jews were being pushed out of the old city of Jerusalem. Arabs were fleeing Israel's north by the tens of thousands. Shortly thereafter, hundreds of thousands of Jews who lived in North African Arab countries would flee, some expelled and others pushed out by mistreatment or the threat of violence. Ultimately, 700,000 Jews would have to leave Arab lands and make their way to the newly found state. For Jews and Arabs alike, it was a period of horrific dislocation. The anger and the bitterness these mass movements of people were engendering would poison the region for decades to come, and I'd say even now. So with the first truth, both sides hemmed, hawed, and eventually agreed on a second truce. Both sides used the quiet of the second truce to use the opportunity to rearm and to bolster troops and fortify their positions. Even while they feverishly prepared for the next round of fighting, Israelis sensed that the tide of the war had shifted, that the conflict might soon be over, and that they would win. reveling in the respite. They even staged Jerusalem's first annual military parade on July 27th, beginning a tradition that would continue for years. Meanwhile, the Arabs had begun to realize that the war to annihilate Israel had failed. They therefore set their sights on a new issue, the fate of the Arab refugees. And I want to just mention here, we've talked about this before, but all there was no such thing as Palestinians as being exclusively Arabs at that time. If Palestine was just the area before 1948, and if you were Jewish, you were Jewish Palestinian. If you were Arab, you were Arab Palestinian. So that really is kind of a made-up term. During the War of Independence, some 700,000 Arabs fled their homes. Benny Morris has shown that the Arabs left for many different reasons. In Jaffa, Haifa, and other large cities and towns, urban societies simply collapsed, particularly as the Arab leadership fled. In other cases, rumors of Jewish atrocities, the vast majority of them were false, but it led Arabs to believe that fleeing was the only way to save their lives. In other cases, Israel did push the Arabs out. Ben-Gurion really felt like he had no choice. His responsibility was to create a viable Jewish state. As historian Morris said, Ben-Gurion understood the demographic issue and the need to establish a Jewish state without a large Arab minority. Nothing else would have been viable. By the war's end, these 700,000 Palestinian refugees, almost precisely the number of Jews who would have to flee Muslim countries, had sought refuge in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Gaza. The Arabs pressed UN Representative Count Bernadotte to make the issue of Arab refugees central to any resolution of the conflict. The Israelis insisted that they would not discuss the refugees as long as the Arabs continued fighting in an effort to destroy the Jewish state. So the Arabs shifted their approach, insisting that there be no peace talks until the issue of the refugees was resolved. Resolving the refugee problem would not be a goal of the negotiations that would follow, but rather had to be a precursor to any talks. So that was the impasse. Essentially, this meant that the refugee problem would forever remain unaddressed. And I want to just stop here and just talk about that, because the people that they're calling refugees right now are the grandsons or granddaughters or great-grandparents, grandsons or granddaughters of those people back then. So it doesn't really make sense to call them refugees when they've been living in that land for many decades. Anyway, from Israel's perspective, it seemed that rather than solving the problem of the refugees, Lebanon, Syria, and to a lesser extent Jordan, chose to keep the refugees as an ace in their pocket. They would use this asset, quote unquote, in future negotiations with the Zionist enemy, for even then they were determined not to end the conflict until Israel no longer existed. Sounds very similar to today, doesn't it? So I want to pause right here, and we want to watch a video together that I think is very interesting. Some of it has to do with the road to Latrun, or rather the Burma Road, but there's some other interesting thing. This is from a website called Unpacked, and it's a Jewish website, but I think it'll be worth watching for us. So just one moment here. Okay.
It's no secret. Israel is often synonymous with high-tech wizardry, and as a tiny nation about the size of New Jersey, it clearly punches above its weight class economically, scientifically, technologically, and militarily. But back during their fight for independence in 1948, the Israelis were underdogs in many ways. They were outgunned, facing multiple trained armies. Not a gambler in Vegas would have bet on the Jews. But what's important to know here is that what the Jews lacked in sheer power, they made up for in resourcefulness and creativity. To paraphrase Hamilton, just like their country, they were young, scrappy, and hungry. They managed to make use of things like the Davidka, a loud, inaccurate, and mostly ineffective weapon. They also spent their nights secretly building dirt roads and dropping soda bottles out of planes. That's right, soda bottles. Crappy weapons, dirt roads, and recycling? How does that help you win a war? You know the story of David and Goliath, right? Little, scrawny guy takes on the Hulk with nothing but a slingshot? Why the Bible lesson? Well, during the Arab-Israeli War in 1948, we had kind of a David and Goliath situation on our hands. The Jews, like I mentioned before, were a scrappy bunch. They had their underground militias, the Haganah and the Irgun, which later became a small official army of the new state of Israel. The Jewish forces then were made up, in large part, by people who had just survived the Holocaust only a few years earlier. Meanwhile, local Arabs were supported by the Arab Legion, Transjordan's well-equipped British-trained army. Now, what we're focusing on is the early portion of the Arab-Israeli War, before the Israelis had to fend off the armies of several surrounding Arab countries. Still, the situation was dire, with the Jews finding themselves outmatched against the professionally trained Arab Legion. The Jews fancied themselves the David to the Arabs' Goliath. So, they needed their slingshot. Instead, they got the Davidka, a weapon named, in part, after the biblical story. Modeled after a primitive Czech weapon, the Davidka looked pretty unimpressive and almost harmless. Anyway, with something like the Davidka, looks can be kind of deceiving. But actually, with the Davidka, the look told pretty much the whole story. It was a 3-inch spigot mortar with low explosive power and unreliable accuracy. But it was loud. In fact, it detonated so thunderously that it created panic among Arab troops. Historians are still pretty unsure as to how much damage the Davidka actually caused, but its real value was scaring off the enemy. Now, only 6 Davidkas were made, but they played a crucial role in the early victories for the Israelis, particularly during one decisive battle in the mountaintop city of Tzfat, which had been home to a thriving Jewish community since the 1500s. With Jews and Arabs wrestling for control of Tzfat, particularly the citadel, an ancient Crusader fortress and the city's highest point, Jewish fighters needed an edge. They turned to the Davidka. The Jewish fighters stationed Davidkas in the city's Jewish quarter and attempted to shell Arab positions. The blasts the Davidka produced caused the Arab troops and many Arab civilians to run for the hills. They evacuated the city, leading to a huge victory for the Israelis. The Arab troops were so terrified by the noise of the Davidka that rumors quickly swirled that the Jews were developing a new secret weapon. Some even thought the Jews had harnessed an ancient, dark, magical power with ties to the occult. I'm totally kidding. But some actually thought they were developing an atomic weapon. They weren't. Or were they? No, they actually weren't. Anyway, one key weapon the Israelis did possess was a makeshift air force. But don't get too excited. With the US and British banning arms shipments to Israel, the young nation turned to Soviet bloc countries, desperate to make arms deals. So the Israelis ended up with a small fleet of poorly conditioned old Czech planes to halt the advances of Arab troops on Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. When Israeli volunteer pilots ran out of bombs, they didn't run out of ideas. They got creative and dropped seltzer bottles in lieu of artillery. That's right. As they fell, the bottles made a loud whistling noise that sounded something like bombs dropping. And the bottles also burst on impact and made one hell of an explosion. Again, much like the Davidka, the noise alone created the illusion of more firepower than the Jews actually had. But in the battle for Jerusalem, the 4,000-year-old city and Israel's future capital was under siege. And the Israelis appeared out of answers. In early 1948, Arab forces took control of key strategic vantage points overlooking the city. See, Jerusalem is situated on a plateau, with mountains surrounding it. With Arab troops also blockading the main road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, it became increasingly difficult for the Jews to get arms and supplies into the city. Things as elementary as food and water. With their supply lines severed, the Jews of Jerusalem were in deep trouble. Panic set in. Food rationing was implemented. The allowance per person per day was set at 2 gallons of water for all bathing and drinking, and 3 slices of bread. Residents were on the verge of starvation. Again, against Goliath, they needed a miracle, a David. A hero. When you think of the heroes in Israel's fight for independence, you probably think of Ben Gurion and his crazy hair, Moshe Dayan and his eye patch, the locals. But it was actually an American who ended the siege of Jerusalem. Ever heard of Mickey Marcus? Well, Mickey Marcus was a bright, athletic kid who grew up in Manhattan on the Lower East Side with Jewish Romanian immigrant parents. A decorated West Point graduate, he fought for the US in World War II and became an advisor to Presidents Roosevelt and Truman. In 1947, Ben Gurion turned to Marcus and asked him to find an American to advise the newly formed Israeli army. When he couldn't find anyone willing to take the job, he volunteered himself. The US War Department allowed it, but under the condition that Marcus operate under a different name. In short order, Michael Stone, a slightly more intimidating name than Mickey Marcus, became the first general of the Israeli army. He instituted a US Army-inspired structure and took control of the Jerusalem forces in the spring of 1948 to help end the siege. Initially, he attempted 2 failed operations against Arab Legion forces to reopen supply lines along the main road between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Then he set out on a new path, literally. Rather than try to reopen the main supply line, he decided to build a brand new secret road that he called the Burma Road. Named after a World War II supply route in China, the Burma Road to Jerusalem was built mostly in secret at night, in the dark, along the imposing rocky slopes of the Judean hills, and under the watchful eyes of Arab Legion troops stationed in fortresses dotted along the route. Using hundreds of Jerusalem quarrymen, volunteers, soldiers, bulldozers, and a handful of donkeys, the Israelis constructed the makeshift road along a narrow footpath worn by centuries of shepherds filled with rocks, pits, and ravines. After 2 weeks, slow-moving supply vehicles were able to make the 6-hour trip. Arab snipers did gun down a small number of Israeli road workers once they spotted activity, but couldn't shell the supply vehicles because crucial parts of the road were cleverly built out of the line of sight of the enemy artillery. Eventually, convoys carried as much as 100 tons of cargo every night over the new Burma Road, effectively ending the siege in Jerusalem just before a United Nations truce in June of 1948. Now, the truce didn't actually end the war, it was only temporary because the war would go on for another 9 months. Unfortunately, General Mickey Marcus was tragically lost to friendly fire just before the truce. Moshe Dayan and others accompanied his body back to the United States for burial, but Marcus and the Burma Road, much like the Davidka, were memorialized. The Israelis' legendary resourcefulness was enough to merit a film adaptation, the 1966 Hollywood movie Cast a Giant Shadow, with stars like John Wayne, Frank Sinatra, Yul Brynner, and, playing Mickey Marcus, Kirk Douglas, whose stage name was also slightly more intimidating than his real name, Isser Danielovich. Hollywood loves a good underdog story, and the story of the Israelis outsmarting the Arab Legion with loud noises, seltzer bottles, and by moonlighting as a construction crew delivers. But with all its successes and its modernity, is Israel still an underdog? A David? Well, when it was established, Israel certainly had the rooting interest of an underdog. Most of the international community, as evidenced by the pivotal 1947 UN vote, supported the Jews, still reeling from the Holocaust, having a nation in their ancestral homeland. But not Israel's neighbors. You see, Israel's ascension to a country known for high-tech mastery and military might isn't by accident, it's out of necessity. Israel is surrounded by countries whose views have always ranged from not thrilled with its existence to openly calling for its destruction, which has forced it to take on what some people might consider the role of Goliath. So, to be clear, Israel had widespread support when things looked bad, really bad, when they were relying on loud bangs and soda bottles to try and win a war. And now? Well, I guess the question becomes this. Is support for Israel contingent upon it being a classic underdog, an entity that's easy to root for because it's expected to lose? That seems like a viewpoint that's lacking nuance and context. This isn't a sport, it's not March Madness. After all, this is real life. Food for thought.
All right. Now, I hope you all were able to see that okay. I thought that was interesting because they're not really coming at it from a Christian viewpoint, but I love the story of the Davidka and how that the Arabs were frightened by the noise of it. It sounds so biblical to me, like so many of the biblical stories that we've heard about. And then the story of the pop bottles was fascinating to me of how they dropped those bottles and made it sound like they were dropping bombs. And certainly God was with them and all that. But in all of this, it to me, I guess one of the takeaways is really you can see the roots of the conflict that's going on now. It's not new. It's been around ever since then, and really even before. But I'm really thankful that the Jewish nation that the Lord blessed them to survive and to prosper even into today. So just a little bit more here. So the Arabs were reticent to sign armistice agreements because their denials notwithstanding, signing any agreement with Israel meant admitting that the battle to destroy the Jewish state had not been lost. Had been lost. Eventually, though, Egypt signed on February 24th, 1949, Lebanon on March 23rd, Jordan on April 3rd, Syria was the last to sign on July 20th, 1949. Israel had secured the victory that the United States State Department had said it could not, but nonetheless emerged from the war badly battered. Some 6,000 Israelis had been killed, one quarter of them civilians. This amounted to nearly 1% of the fledgling state's Jewish population. You know, in the war that's going on right now, there's been a number. I don't think we've hit 1,000 of Israeli soldiers, but this is in a much larger context, a much larger country now. When there was only 600,000 people at that time. So more than 500 women had been killed, 108 of them in military service. Percentage-wise, the Palestinian Arabs lost roughly an equivalent number, about 1% of the civilian population. The biggest losers in the conflict were Palestine's Arabs, who came to refer to this period as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Some 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were displaced by the war, and thousands more died. It was a terrible human toll. That so many Palestinian Arabs had to leave their homes was undeniably heartbreaking, and Israel had, without doubt, played a role in their displacement. At the same time, however, what turned the heartbreak into genuine human tragedy was the decision of their new host countries to deliberately perpetuate their homelessness to foment international condemnation of Israel, maintaining the refugee status of the Palestinians who had entered their countries gave the Lebanese, Syrians, Jordanians, and Egyptians a card they were intent on playing as the conflict unfolded. Israel did precisely the opposite with Jews who were homeless. When hundreds of thousands of Jews evicted from Arab countries reached Israel's shores, the Jewish state granted them citizenship. One was a response of cynicism and manipulation, while the other was a commitment to peoplehood and a vision of a brighter future. Those differing responses made all the difference in what the future would hold for each population. So, to me, this is very helpful in understanding the roots of the conflict today. Next week, Lord willing, we'll be talking about the Six-Day War, which was resulted in Israel being able to retake the old city in Jerusalem and worship at the Western Wall once again.